Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something, well, pretty fundamental in politics. What happens when confidence just disappears?
Right. Whether that's citizens suddenly losing faith that their government knows what it's doing, or, maybe a key ally starting to question a big power's actual commitment.
And the shifts that follow can be incredibly fast,
Yeah.
really dramatic.
That's exactly the theme running through our source material today.
Yeah.
We've got quite a stack here covering two things that seem separate at first glance, but they're linked.
Okay, what have we got?
We're looking at the frankly stunning collapse of political support up in Canada, driven by domestic economic problems. And then shifting focus, the really high-stakes, almost transactional game playing out across the Pacific. U.S., China, Taiwan.
So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from all this, to understand what's really driving these big economic and geopolitical shifts right now.
And especially focusing on what voters and even whole nations start prioritizing when they feel like they're kind of adrift, lost.
It's a study in how people and countries react when they perceive paralysis, maybe inaction.
Yeah, resilience and reaction. So let's start with that political shockwave hitting Canada. It's such a clear lesson, I think, in how those standard economic numbers, they just don't always capture the reality people are feeling.
That's the big question the sources dig into, isn't it? I mean, if unemployment is pretty low, around 5.5%, and inflation is, manageable at 3%, why did the political ground just fall away?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. But the analysis we're looking at is really clear. It pins the political decline almost entirely on one single massive factor.
Which is?
The cost of living, obviously, but drilling down even deeper. It's the housing crisis. I mean, the data is just staggering. Housing affordability in Canada hit its absolute lowest point since 2022.
The lowest point ever recorded, basically. And this isn't just a blip, is it? Not just a bad cycle.
No. And the sources really point fingers at a systemic issue. Housing has been treated less like a place to live, a necessity, and much more like an investment, a tool for capital growth.
Right, like an asset class first, shelter second.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that whole approach has effectively just locked out younger generations and lower-income people, too.
Yeah.
Priced them right out of major housing markets.
And the political fallout from that inaction, or maybe the perception of inaction?
Well, it's created this trap, hasn't it? It signals to a huge chunk of voters that the government is either, unwilling or maybe just unable to take the kind of bold action needed to fix something so fundamental to quality of life.
And that just erodes confidence. Deeply.
Or profoundly. And this crisis then smashes right into something the sources call the immigration paradox.
Okay, explain that paradox, because on one hand, the analysis says Canada absolutely needs high immigration rates.
It does, for purely economic reasons, really. You've got an aging population, a big financial burden there, plus the single-payer healthcare system needs funding and workers. So immigration is vital for demographic stability.
There's always a but.
But here's the collision course. Those current high immigration numbers are seen, rightly or wrongly, as making the housing crisis worse. Especially in the big cities where things are already stretched thin.
So the timing was just terrible.
Critics argue it was, yeah. The specific criticism leveled at the Liberal government is that they really ramped up those immigration targets without, crucially, getting the infrastructure ready, or even having a solid plan for the housing demand that would inevitably create.
And the language used in the sources about this failure, it's pretty stark.
Oh, yeah. One analysis flat out called the strategy feckless or reckless. And you see the human side of this mismatch, the real cost, in these anecdotes that surfaced. Reports of international students, new arrivals having to sleep rough in encampments because there just wasn't housing.
Wow, that kind of image, that must be absolutely devastating for public trust in the government's competence.
Completely. And it certainly makes those okay-ish unemployment and inflation numbers feel, well, almost irrelevant, doesn't it?
Totally irrelevant if you can't find a place to live or afford your rent. But it's not just housing, is it? There seems to be a broader sense of economic unease.
That's right. The sources talk about the public being plainly scarred by the price surges over the last few years. People got used to really low inflation, under 2% for a long time.
Yeah, that stability was the norm.
And now you add rising interest rates on top of that.
Mm.
Well, it's really starting to pinch household budgets. People are feeling it.
Mm. And lurking beneath that immediate pain, there's this deeper issue the sources highlight. Economic inertia, stagnation.
Yeah, that's maybe the most alarming long-term finding. Canada seems to be grappling with a serious productivity crisis, and the evidence is stark. GDP per capita, basically, how much economic value is generated per person. It hasn't grown in 6 years.
6 years. That's significant stagnation. But hang on, if the stagnation started 6 years ago, why the political collapse now?
Ah, good question. I think it's because the housing crisis made that abstract stagnation suddenly feel very concrete, very personal, very painful.
Okay, it became impossible to ignore.
Exactly. But even more critically, it seems the perception of competence, or rather incompetence, is what truly tanked the government's support. The single most remarkable finding in the national polls cited
Yeah.
is that across all the major issues, cost of living, housing, immigration, the largest group of respondents believe the government simply has no plan.
No plan, not a bad plan, just nothing. That feeling of being adrift.
That's it. That lack of clarity, that perceived lack of competence is what's driving voters batty, as one source put it. It's the sense of paralysis, maybe more than the pain itself, that triggered the shift.
So the political ground shifted completely, away from maybe broader ideals towards...
Towards the naked self-interest and pocketbook policies, that's the phrase used, which translates directly into this widespread feeling that it's time for a change.
And the polls reflect that decisively.
Oh, absolutely. Conservatives leading by significant margins, 11 to 14 points in most polls cited. And the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, has been laser-focused on housing, and the messaging seems to be landing effectively.
So the big takeaway here, maybe before we switch gears, is that perceived government inertia, that feeling that they're stuck on really core quality of life issues like housing, that can just completely wipe out any credit from decent economic stats.
Precisely. And cause a swift, almost brutal electoral collapse. It's the absence of a visible plan that seems to just shatter public confidence.
Okay. That idea of paralysis, the absence of a clear plan, it actually provides a pretty good bridge to our next topic, doesn't it?
It really does. We've just seen what happens when voters lose faith that their own government will act decisively. Now let's look at what happens when nations start to doubt their allies' commitment. We're shifting from that domestic inertia to more global transactionalism.
Right. We're moving across the Pacific now, looking at that incredibly complex, delicate relationship between the U.S., China, and Taiwan, which, under the new U.S. administration, seems to be defined much more by, well, economic nationalism and these sort of transactional security arrangements.
That's the frame. And the major shift underpinning it all is economic. The U.S. is making very deliberate moves away from granting China permanent, unconditional privileged access to its markets. That's the PNTR status.
Okay, so for anyone listening who doesn't follow trade policy day to day, ending PNTR, permanent normal trade relations, what does that actually mean in practice? Why is it such a big deal?
Well, ending PNTR would mean China's trade status with the U.S. isn't guaranteed anymore. It would likely face an annual review by Congress, maybe with conditions attached.
So it injects massive uncertainty.
Huge uncertainty into basically every aspect of U.S.-China business and trade. It's a fundamental break from decades of moving towards greater economic integration, a really tectonic shift.
And the administration isn't just talking concepts. There are specific, very punchy proposals on the table, right?
Extremely punchy. The sources detail, first, plans to actually assess legislation to formally end or limit that PNTR status. And then the big numbers, proposing tariffs of 60% on Chinese goods.
60%, that's huge.
Massive. And alongside that, a kind of universal baseline tariff of 10% on pretty much all imported goods from everywhere.
So the 10% is the general framework, but that's 60% targeted at China. That's the real weapon here. Why so high? Is it just punishment, or is there a strategic reason?
It's partly about stopping evasion, the sources suggest. These kinds of trade measures, especially that high tariff, are explicitly designed to prevent what's called transshipment.
That's where Chinese goods get rerouted through other countries to hide their origin.
Exactly. Falsely labeled, sent through Vietnam or Mexico or somewhere else to avoid tariffs. The idea is any country caught helping China do that could face similar punitive tariffs themselves, maybe in that 60% range too. It raises the stakes for everyone.
Okay. And one concrete action has already been taken, targeting a loophole that sounds enormous. The administration suspended the de minimis exemption for commercial imports from China. Can you break down what de minimis is?
Yeah, de minimis is basically a threshold, currently $800 in the U.S. Commercial shipments under that value come in largely without facing tariffs or rigorous customs inspection.
And China uses this a lot.
Extensively. The sources say the overwhelming majority, like a huge number of individual small packages coming into the U.S., fall under this rule, primarily from China. Think online shopping platforms.
Right, Shane, Temu, those kinds of direct shipments.
Exactly. So suspending it just for China means suddenly every single one of those small packages, no matter the value, could be subject to inspection and tariffs. It closes off a massive channel for untaxed, often unscrutinized goods.
Okay, so economically, the message is really clear. Barriers are going up, enforcement is getting tougher. What about the security side? The rhetoric there sounds just as sharp.
Absolutely. Confidential Pentagon directives, cited in the material, state pretty unequivocally that China is the only pacing threat for the U.S. military. That's a very specific designation.
Pacing threat, meaning the benchmark against which U.S. capabilities are measured.
Precisely. And the security strategy flowing from that is focused squarely on preventing war, the means, deterrence and denial. It's guided by that classic phrase, peace through strength.
And there have been direct warnings regarding Taiwan.
Very direct. The defense secretary himself issued a stark warning, saying any forced invasion of Taiwan by China would result in devastating consequences. So the stated U.S. goal is this dual priority. Stop China from presenting a fait accompli over Taiwan while also making sure the American homeland itself is safe.
And it's fascinating how the administration seems to be linking that homeland security piece, specifically the fentanyl crisis, directly to trade enforcement with China.
It's a complete fusion, really, of economics and national security policy. According to the policy experts cited in our sources, the view is that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is directly culpable in fueling the American fentanyl crisis.
How so? What's the alleged mechanism?
Because Chinese precursor chemicals, the raw ingredients, are described as the backbone of the entire fentanyl supply chain flowing into North America.
And the sources mention investigations suggesting actual government support.
Disturbing findings, yeah. They allege that the PRC government might be actively subsidizing the manufacture and export of these illicit fentanyl materials. Things like tax rebates, maybe grants for companies involved in producing these precursors, effectively boosting the global drug trade.
Wow. If that's true, it's explosive.
It is. And it leads to this critical point about leverage. China is accused in these analyses of using fentanyl cooperation, or the lack of it, as a kind of bargaining chip to try and get concessions on trade or other diplomatic issues.
So how has the U.S. responded to that perceived linkage?
Tangibly, with tariffs, specifically imposing an additional 20% tariff on certain Chinese goods. And these tariffs are explicitly linked to allegations that China hasn't done enough to stop the flow of these precursor chemicals.
So trade policy becomes a direct tool to fight a public health crisis and a perceived national security threat.
Exactly. It really cements this idea that economic leverage isn't just about trade deficits anymore. It's becoming the primary tool for enforcement on security issues too, not just relying on diplomacy.
But this whole aggressive posture, this transactional approach, it must raise some serious questions for U.S. partners, right? Especially Taiwan, sitting right there in the crosshairs.
Huge questions. They're watching this play out incredibly closely, which logically leads us to pivot to Taiwan's own strategy in response.
Right. President Lai Ching-te has laid out this 4 pillars of peace action plan. What's the core idea there? It sounds like a strategy focused on self-reliance.
Very much so. It's fundamentally a self-help strategy. It emphasizes strengthening Taiwan's own economic resilience, yes, and pursuing what they call strategic interdependence with the U.S. and other partners.
Okay, interdependence makes sense. But what about defense?
That's the real core of it. The plan includes a pledge to boost defense spending to exceed 3% of Taiwan's GDP. Though, interestingly, the sources note that some U.S. advisors, probably sensing the urgency, suggested they should be aiming much higher, maybe even 10%.
10%, that's a wartime level almost. That focus on self-reliance, though, it speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It really does. Because, despite all the strong rhetoric from Washington about the shared threat from China, there's this underlying tension. Within some U.S. policy circles, Taiwan is seen as, yes, a vital strategic outpost, but also potentially as a potential bargaining chip.
A bargaining chip in the bigger U.S.-China game.
That's the uncomfortable reality described.
Yeah.
It's part of that long-standing U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity, but it feels particularly sharp in this transactional environment.
And the sources provide actual examples of this transactional approach potentially overriding support for Taiwan.
They do. There's evidence cited suggesting that certain high-level gestures towards Taiwan were either declined or maybe canceled by U.S. officials. Specifically, a proposed presidential transit through the U.S. and even a scheduled meeting with Taiwan's defense minister.
Canceled? Why would they pull back on things like that, especially now? What was the calculation?
Well, according to the analysis, the calculation was purely transactional stability. These gestures were reportedly shelved to preserve a more favorable climate for the really sensitive ongoing U.S.-China trade negotiations,
Ah.
and also to kind of smooth a diplomatic path for potential summits between the U.S. and Chinese presidents. Essentially, the stability of that top-level U.S.-China relationship, especially the economic track, was prioritized over making a strong diplomatic statement of support for Taiwan right at that moment.
That is quite profound. It suggests the immediate security anxieties or diplomatic needs of key partner can be subordinated to the bigger goal of managing the great power competition, particularly the economic piece.
Exactly. And we saw that same kind of transactional dynamic play out very recently, didn't we? In that phone call between the two presidents, which was described afterwards as very good.
Right. They agreed to meet at the APEC summit, talked trade, fentanyl, and even reportedly a potential deal regarding TikTok.
Yeah, it's a perfect illustration, isn't it? Geopolitical strategy, even when facing a major threat, often seems dictated by the overriding need to keep that channel open for negotiation, even if it means putting ally reassurance on the back burner sometimes.
Okay, so let's try and pull these two different threads together as we wrap up.
Right.
We've looked at this domestic political implosion in Canada, driven by a specific failure, and then this high-stakes global maneuvering across the Pacific. What are the sort of core insights connecting them?
Well, I think there are two main ones that jump out from the sources. First, on the domestic side, it's just how overwhelmingly political shifts can be driven by that perception of government paralysis, especially on a single, really high-stakes, quality-of-life issue like housing in Canada.
That feeling of being adrift, of your government having no plan, seems almost more toxic than bad economic numbers themselves.
Exactly. That seems to be the key lesson there.
Mm.
And then second, on the geopolitical side, is how often strategic calculations, even when you've clearly identified a casing threat like China, seem to get subordinated
Subordinate to what?
to the immediate needs of transactional trade deals and just preserving diplomatic stability. The economic relationship or managing it often seems to trump the urgency of the strategic threat, at least in the short term.
So the consequence of both these things, whether you're a Canadian voter worried about affording rent, or you're the Taiwanese government worried about an invasion,
The necessary response ends up looking quite similar, doesn't it? Both actors are kind of forced towards self-help, toward building their own resilience, because they perceive either their own government or perhaps their key ally is prioritizing maybe short-term stability or these transactional politics over decisive long-term action or commitment.
that's a really powerful link between that feeling of domestic disappointment and a sense of global uncertainty. It really leaves us with one final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah, think about this. If the U.S. is now using tariffs and really aggressive trade enforcement, not just as economic tools, but explicitly as weapons to fight the fentanyl crisis, which is framed as both a public health disaster and a national security threat, does that signal something permanent?
Meaning, are we entering a new era where economic policy and national security are just fundamentally inseparable now? Or
Or is this strategy, however effective it might seem against fentanyl, ultimately just another, perhaps more potent, bargaining chip in the ongoing great power competition between the U.S. and China?
a really critical distinction to try and figure out. We've certainly seen how blurred those lines have become today. That's all the time we have for this deep dive.